She pressed her baby against her chest and screamed at the locked door, not for herself, but for the child she knew she could no longer save alone. Every family along that road had turned her away. Every door had shut in her face. She had walked 4 days through Montana's brutal summer heat, with nothing but the sound of Lily's fading breathing to keep her moving. And now, standing at the last ranch at the edge of the valley, she did the only thing she had left. She begged, "Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a single chapter. And when you're done watching, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels." Now let's go back to that doorstep in Montana, 1883, and find out what one quiet rancher did that nobody in that valley ever forgot. The baby made no sound. That was what terrified Sarah Caldwell the most. Not the heat pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. Not the cracked skin on the soles of her feet. Not the burning in her arms from carrying Lily for 4 days without rest. It was the silence. A baby was supposed to cry. Lily had stopped crying somewhere around the 2nd day. And since then, Sarah had been pressing her lips against her daughter's forehead every few minutes, just to feel the warmth still there, just to know there was still something to fight for. She had counted 6 farmhouses. 6 doors knocked on. 6 different faces staring at her like she was something dangerous, something broken, something they did not want near their children or their property. One woman had actually pushed her off the porch steps. Another man had come to the door with a rifle already in his hand before Sarah had finished her first sentence. She understood in the abstract why people were afraid of her. A woman alone on the frontier with a sick infant, and no explanation that made sense. It looked like trouble. It smelled like trouble. In 1883, a woman without a husband, without a name, anyone recognized without papers or money or a single soul to vouch for her, she was not a person who inspired charity. She was a person who inspired suspicion. But understanding something and surviving it were 2 entirely different things. The Walker Ranch sat at the far edge of the valley like it had been placed there as an afterthought. A low-slung house with a long porch, a barn that needed painting, and a windmill that turned slowly in the dry afternoon air. There were horses in the far paddock and a vegetable garden along the south side of the house that someone had actually tended to with care. That detail struck Sarah as important somehow. A man who kept a garden that neat had not given up on things growing. She did not let herself think about what she would do if this door closed too. Her legs gave out on the last stretch of the dirt path. Not dramatically, not in the way the dime novels described women fainting, but simply and completely, the way a person gives out when they have reached the absolute boundary of what the human body can sustain. Her knees hit the dirt. Lily slipped slightly in her arms, and Sarah caught her, clutching her so hard that if the baby had been stronger, she would have cried from it. Sarah pressed her mouth against Lily's ear and whispered, "We're here, baby girl. We're here. You hold on just a little longer. You hear me? You hold on." She pushed herself back to her feet. She walked the last 30 yards to that porch on sheer refusal. Not courage. There was nothing noble about it. It was just refusal. The refusal of a mother to be the reason her child died. She knocked on the door. The man who opened it was not what she expected. She had been bracing for another suspicious face, another rifle, another door swinging shut before she could finish her sentence. But Ethan Walker simply stood there in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a face that looked like it had been weathered by something beyond just sun and wind. He was 38, though in that moment he looked older, not in a diminished way, but in the way that men look older when life has carved something permanent into them. He looked at her. He looked at Lily. He did not say a word. Sarah opened her mouth, and what came out was not the careful speech she had been rehearsing for 4 days. It was not the logical, orderly explanation she had constructed in her head during those long hours of walking, the version where she stayed calm and dignified and gave him every reason to help her. What came out was the truth underneath all of that. "Please," she said, "take my baby. Just take her. Let her live. I can't. She hasn't, please. You don't have to take me in. You don't have to believe anything I tell you. But please, please take my baby. She's burning up and I don't know what else to do. I've been to 6 houses and nobody will please just take Lily. Let her live. She didn't do anything wrong. She's just a baby. She's just—" Her voice cracked completely. She held Lily out toward him with both arms, this tiny, frighteningly still child, wrapped in a shawl that had long since soaked through with sweat, and she waited for him to take the baby and close the door. Ethan Walker did not take the baby. He looked at Lily for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Sarah. Really looked at her the way nobody had looked at her in a very long time, like she was a person whose situation mattered rather than a problem to be solved or avoided. His jaw tightened. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Get inside," he said. "Both of you." Sarah stood there for a moment, not moving, because her body did not entirely believe what her ears had just heard. "Ma'am." His voice was not unkind, but it carried a firmness that cut through her shock. "That baby needs to get out of this heat right now. So do you. Get inside." She walked through the door. The inside of the house was plain and clean, in the way of a place kept tidy by necessity, rather than decoration. A fireplace along one wall. A wooden table with 4 chairs, shelves with jars and tools, and a row of books that surprised her. A child's drawing was tacked to the wall near the window. The floor was swept. Everything had a place. Ethan was already moving. He went to the fireplace and stoked it despite the heat outside, because he understood something. Sarah had not fully registered yet. Lily's danger was not from the sun, but from the fever beneath her skin, and what a fever needed was careful warmth, not cold. He disappeared into another room and came back with a folded blanket, then went again and returned with a tin cup of water. "Sit down," he told Sarah. "Hold her just like that. Keep her head up. Can you tell if she's breathing?" He crouched down in front of her and put 2 fingers gently against Lily's neck, feeling the pulse there, and his expression remained unreadable for a moment. "Pulse is weak, but it's there. How long since she's taken any milk?" "This morning. She would barely take it. I've been trying to keep her fed, but I don't have enough. I haven't been able to eat enough to—" "You're nursing her?" "Yes." He stood up. "I've got a goat out back. Fresh milk. I'll get some and we'll warm it. It's not the same, but it'll do until you've rested and eaten. She needs fluid more than anything right now." Sarah stared at him. "Why are you helping me?" The question came out before she could stop it. It wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely bewildered, the question of someone who had been turned away so many times that help itself had become incomprehensible. Ethan looked at her steadily. "Because you needed it," he said, like that was the most obvious thing in the world. He went out the back door without another word. Sarah sat in that chair holding Lily and felt something happening to her face that she realized after a moment was crying. Not the desperate sobbing of those hours on the road. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like the particular kind of release that only comes when you have been holding yourself together through sheer will for so long that the first moment of safety simply dismantles you completely. She pressed her forehead against Lily's and whispered, "We made it, baby. We made it somewhere." A sound on the stairs made her look up. A boy stood on the bottom step, staring at her with wide brown eyes that she recognized immediately as Ethan's same shape, same directness, same way of looking, that asked questions without apologizing for asking them. He was maybe 9 years old, wearing patched pants and a shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone from whatever color it started as to a soft general gray. His feet were bare on the wooden floor. "Are you sick?" he asked. "No," Sarah said. "I'm just very tired." "Is your baby sick?" "She has a fever. Your father, is he, your father?" The boy nodded. "Your father is getting milk for her. He's going to help her get better." The boy looked at Lily for a long moment with the concentrated seriousness of a child who understands that something important is happening. Then he came down the last step and crossed the room and stood about 2 feet away, close enough to see Lily's face properly. "She's really small," he said. "She's 4 months old. What's her name?" "Lily." "I'm Noah." He paused. "She's pretty, even when she's sick." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even known was clenched. "Thank you, Noah." Ethan came back through the door carrying a small pail of fresh milk. He moved to the stove and began warming it in a pot, and as he worked, Noah drifted naturally into the kitchen and sat on a stool near the counter, the way children do when something interesting is happening and they don't want to miss any of it. "Pa," Noah said. She said the baby's name is Lily." Ethan glanced over his shoulder briefly. "I know." "Can they stay?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Ethan stirred the milk without looking up. Sarah opened her mouth to say that she did not expect that she would leave as soon as Lily was stable, that she wasn't asking for more than a few hours. "We'll see," Ethan said. He said it to Noah, but Sarah understood it was also said to her, and it was not a dismissal. It was a man who moved carefully through the world because he had learned what happened when you moved carelessly through it. He brought her a bowl of broth first, setting it on the table next to her chair without comment, and then he brought the warmed goat's milk in a small cup with a cloth twisted into a makeshift feeding wick, the kind of improvised solution that only came from actual experience with helpless creatures that needed care. "I raised 2 orphaned calves this way," he said, seeing her expression. "The technique works. Keep her head tilted just slightly. Go slow." Sarah did exactly as he said, and after a few minutes of coaxing, Lily swallowed, then swallowed again. It was such a small thing. 4 ounces of warm milk given to a sick infant by a method usually reserved for livestock, but it was the most significant thing that had happened to Sarah Caldwell in weeks, because it meant her daughter was still fighting. She looked up at Ethan and said, "Thank you." He nodded once. Then he sat down across from her at the table and folded his hands and looked at her with that steady, direct gaze. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "Not tonight. You need to eat and rest and keep that baby warm. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't going to need to understand the situation before long." Sarah met his eyes. "I know. There's somebody looking for you." The pause before she answered told him everything, even before the words came. "Yes," she said quietly. "My husband." Ethan's expression did not change dramatically, just the smallest tightening around his eyes. "He hurt you." It was not a question. Sarah said nothing for a moment. Then, "I left him. He won't see it that way." "How will he see it?" "He'll say I stole our daughter. He'll say I'm not well, that I'm confused." She looked down at Lily. "He's very good at making people believe things." "Is he right about any of it?" The directness of the question would have offended her if it had come with any meanness in it. But there was none. It was the question of a man who needed accurate information in order to make decisions, and who considered her capable of providing it honestly. "No," Sarah said. "He's not right. Lily is my daughter, and she was in danger in that house, and I did what I had to do to get her out." Ethan held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if something had been settled internally that he didn't need to announce out loud. "All right," he said. "Tonight you sleep, both of you. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." He showed her to a small room off the hallway, sparse clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out toward the barn. There was a cradle near the wall that stopped her cold, because it was clearly not something he had improvised or pulled from storage. It was well made and obviously old, the wood worn smooth with use, and she understood without being told that it had been Noah's, and before that, perhaps something more painful. She turned to say something about it to acknowledge it in some way, but Ethan was already at the door. "Call out if her breathing changes," he said. "I'll hear you." "Mr. Walker," he paused. "I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He turned back. "All right." "When I asked you to take my baby," Sarah said carefully, "just take her and let me go. Why didn't you?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't have an answer, she realized, but because he was deciding how honest to be. "Because it didn't look to me like what you needed was someone to take your baby," he said finally. "It looked like what you needed was someone to keep you from walking away from her." He closed the door quietly behind him. Sarah stood in that small room for a long time after he left, looking at the cradle and the window and the unfamiliar walls of the first safe place she had been in longer than she could accurately remember. Then she laid Lily down carefully in the cradle, pausing with her hands on either side of the baby until she was sure the breathing was steady, and she sat on the edge of the bed and took the first full, unhurried breath she had taken in 4 days. Outside, she could hear Ethan and Noah moving through the house. Low voices, the sound of the stove being banked boots on the porch steps. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a household settling into its evening. She had forgotten what those sounds felt like from the inside. She did not sleep for a long time. She sat in the dark and listened to her daughter breathe and tried to think clearly about what came next, because she was not a woman who allowed herself the luxury of pretending that finding shelter meant the danger was over. Thomas would look for her. She had known that before she walked out the door with Lily in her arms, and the knowing had not stopped her, because the alternative was staying. And staying had its own kind of danger, the slower kind, the kind that didn't leave marks you could show to a judge. Thomas Vance was 35 years old, and he had been considered one of the most respectable men in Harlow Creek, Montana for most of his adult life. He had a dry goods business that was profitable and well run. He sat on the town council. He had a handshake that made people feel trusted, and a smile that he deployed with the precision of a man who had long since figured out that charm was a tool as effective as any other. People liked Thomas. They respected him. They believed him. That was the part that had terrified Sarah most. Not his anger. Though his anger was real, and it had cost her in concrete ways she did not let herself dwell on. It was his plausibility. His ability to take any situation and shape a narrative around it that cast him as reasonable and her as something else. Over-emotional, confused, difficult. She had learned early in their marriage that when Thomas decided something was true, he willed the world around him into agreement with it through the sheer force of his certainty and his charm. She had spent years questioning her own perception because he questioned it so consistently and so confidently. And then Lily was born. Lily changed things. Lily made the stakes concrete in a way that Sarah's own welfare had never quite managed to do. Because there is a particular clarity that comes to a person when the threat shifts from themselves to their child, a kind of cold, determined understanding that bypasses doubt entirely. The night she left, Thomas had told her that Lily was a liability. He had said it casually, the way he said things that were intended to land as facts rather than opinions. He had looked at their 4-month-old daughter and used the word liability. And something in Sarah had simply stopped. She had waited until he slept. She had packed what she could carry. She had taken Lily and walked out the door into the Montana night, and she had not looked back, not once, because she did not trust what looking back might do to her resolve. She had been walking for 4 days, in the cradle across the room. Lily made a small sound, not distress, just the shifting, sighing sound of an infant moving between sleep states, and Sarah was on her feet and at the cradle's edge before the sound fully registered, her hand resting on Lily's chest, feeling the rise and fall of it. "I've got you," she whispered. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." She was still there when the first pale light came through the window. She heard Ethan before she saw him, his boots on the porch, then the door, then the sound of the stove coming to life as he built the morning fire. After a while, she could smell coffee. After a while after that, there was a soft knock on her door. 2 knocks, not demanding, just indicating presence. She opened it. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he held one out to her without comment, the way a person does when they've decided that some things don't need to be made into a transaction. She took it. Lily's fever broke sometime in the night. Something in his face shifted just briefly, just a shadow of the relief he clearly felt. "Good. The goat's milk helped." "Good," he said again. They stood in the doorway for a moment, drinking coffee in the early morning quiet, and Sarah thought about how strange it was to be standing in a stranger's house, feeling something that was almost comfortable. Not safe. She did not allow herself to use that word yet, but almost comfortable, the way you feel when you're cold, and you step out of the wind, even if the temperature itself hasn't changed. "She said her name is Sarah," Noah said from down the hallway. They both looked. He was already dressed, standing in the hall with his boots on, and his hair still pressed flat from sleep on one side. "I know her name," Ethan said. "You didn't introduce yourself properly last night." Noah informed him with the absolute certainty of a child who has decided to take someone else's etiquette situation in hand. He looked at Sarah. His name is Ethan Walker. He's the best rancher in this valley. He also makes the second best biscuits, but I make the best ones. Sarah felt the smile before she could stop it. Is that right? Yes, ma'am. I've been told I have a gift. Noah. Ethan's voice was flat, but there was nothing genuinely warning in it. I'm just stating facts, Pa. Sarah looked at Ethan. He was looking at his son with an expression she recognized, the particular expression of a parent watching their child do something that would be insufferable if it weren't also entirely genuinely a little endearing. The biscuits are actually quite good, Ethan said, and went back toward the kitchen. The day passed in a way that Sarah had not experienced in years, ordinary and quiet and purposeful. She helped where she could, though Ethan was careful not to make her feel obligated the way some people would have. There was no performance of generosity that required her performance of gratitude in return. He simply did what needed doing and let her do the same, and when their paths crossed in the household tasks of the day, there was something functional and straightforward about it that she found easier to accept than kindness would have been. She learned things about him in fragments. His wife's name had been Clara. She had died 3 years. Ethan volunteering this information in the matter-of-fact tone of a man who had made his peace with grief without pretending it was gone. He had raised Noah alone since then. He had worked this ranch since he was 22, first with Clara and then without her. He had one neighbor he trusted, a man named Gerald Holtz, who ranched the next property over, and the rest of the valley's opinion of him he held at arm's length with a patience that suggested he had long since decided other people's judgments were not his business to manage. People around here leave you alone? Sarah asked late in the afternoon when Noah had gone out to the paddock and she and Ethan were sitting at the kitchen table, she with Lily in her arms and he with a piece of leather harness he was mending. Mostly, he said. I don't cause trouble and I don't invite it. They'll talk when they find out I'm here. He didn't look up from the harness. Let them. It's not just talk I'm worried about, Mr. Walker. Howe was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the harness and looked at her directly. Tell me about your husband. She had known this conversation was coming. She had been turning it over in her head all day, deciding how much to say, trying to find the version that was honest without being so raw that it fell apart in the telling. She said, Thomas Vance owns the dry goods store in Harlow Creek. He's on the town council. He knows the sheriff. He knows the judge. He has money and he has reputation and he's very convincing when he decides to be. And you left him with your daughter. I left him to save her. From what specifically? Sarah looked down at Lily. The baby was sleeping now, genuinely sleeping, with the healthy color returning to her face and her breathing easy and even. And Sarah held that image as an anchor while she said the next part. He told me Lily was a liability. That's the word he used. A liability. Because she was a girl, and he had wanted a son, you understand. And when it was a daughter, he stopped seeing her as a child. She was 4 months old, and he referred to her like she was something gone wrong in his ledger. She paused. He had started to, there were things he did. Not to Lily, not yet. But the way he looked at her was beginning to change, and I knew what that change meant, because I'd watched that same change happen with how he looked at me, and I wasn't willing to wait and see if I was right. Ethan was very still. You were not wrong to leave, he said. I know, Sarah said. I've always known. It just gets... She stopped. It gets harder to know things clearly when someone has been telling you the opposite for long enough. He nodded slowly. I understand that. She looked at him. Something in the way he said it suggested he was not speaking theoretically, and she did not press him on it, but she filed it away, that this man knew something personal about the distance between what you understood to be true and what you could convince yourself to believe in the presence of strong enough contrary pressure. He'll come, she said. It might take him a week or two to trace me here, but he'll come. And when he does, Ethan said, we'll deal with it. The we of it stopped her. She wasn't sure he noticed he'd said it. He picked up the harness again and returned to his mending. And after a moment, Sarah shifted Lily to her other arm and simply sat with the fact of it, that somewhere between midnight and noon in this plain, honest house at the edge of the valley, she had gone from I to we without either of them deciding it, and that it did not frighten her the way it perhaps should have. Noah came in from the paddock when the sun was getting low, tracking dust across the clean floor in the easy way of a child who has never been made to feel that his presence was an inconvenience. He went directly to Sarah and looked at Lily with the focused interest he'd been showing all day. "She looks better," he said with satisfaction, like he'd had a hand in it. "She is better," Sarah confirmed. "Much better. She's gonna be okay." He said it with the absolute certainty of a 9-year-old who has decided the situation is resolved. "Pa makes everything okay. He's good at it." Ethan at the stove said nothing. Sarah looked over at him, at the set of his shoulders, and the careful way he moved through the business of the evening, practical and unhurried, taking up no more space than he needed. And she thought about a man who had been alone for 3 years and kept a garden and raised a son and mended things when they needed mending and opened his door to a woman with a dying baby without asking a single question first. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm beginning to see that." Outside, the Montana sky was going purple and gold along the horizon. The windmill turned. The horses moved in the paddock with the slow, quiet certainty of animals that were well kept and knew it. Inside, for the first time in longer than Sarah could clearly remember, the sounds of a household settling into its evening did not carry the particular specific quality of dread. She sat at that table while Ethan and Noah moved around her, like she had always been there, like there had always been a chair at this table for exactly this person. And she looked down at her daughter's sleeping face and felt something shift in the deepest part of her chest. Not hope exactly. Not yet, because she was not a woman who let herself reach for that particular word until she had more evidence than one good day, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like ground under her feet after a very long time of nothing but air. She did not know yet what Thomas would do when he found her. She did not know yet what the town would say. She did not know yet what Ethan Walker was prepared to stand behind when things got difficult, because saying, "We'll deal with it," over a mending project was different from standing in front of your neighbors and calling a wealthy man a liar to his face. But she knew that Lily was breathing easily in her arms. And she knew that someone had left a lamp burning in the window. And she knew that somewhere in this quiet house, a 9-year-old boy had decided with the full and uncomplicated authority of childhood that everything was going to be okay. She held on to that. She held on to all of it. And she let herself, just for tonight, believe him. 3 days after Lily's fever broke, Sarah found her rhythm in the Walker house. It was not a grand thing, rhythm never was. It was small and practical, the kind that builds itself out of necessity rather than choice. She was up before Noah, which meant she was up not long after Ethan, and in those early mornings she learned that the Walker household operated on a kind of wordless efficiency that she recognized as the particular language of people who had learned to communicate through doing rather than saying. Ethan would have the stove going by the time she brought Lily into the kitchen. He would move to one side without being asked so she could warm the goat's milk. Noah would appear somewhere around the 3rd cup of coffee, hair sideways, boots already on, asking questions about the day, with the relentless appetite of a child for whom every morning was an unopened thing. It should have felt precarious living in a borrowed space under borrowed grace, knowing the clock was running somewhere she couldn't see. But it didn't, or rather it did, and she felt that precariousness alongside something else, something she hadn't had room for in years, and the two of them existed in her chest simultaneously, like weather systems moving in opposite directions. She had started to help with the mending. Not because Ethan asked, he didn't ask for anything, but because sitting still had always made her worse, and her hands needed something to do, while her mind ran its quiet, constant calculations about Thomas. About time. About how many days she probably had left before his search for her led him here. It was on the 4th morning that Noah asked the question she had been waiting for. He asked it the way 9-year-olds ask things, without preamble, without any apparent awareness that it might require navigation. "Why did you run away from your husband?" Sarah looked up from the shirt she was mending. Noah was at the table eating, watching her with those direct brown eyes that were so much like Ethan's, it still caught her off guard. "Noah." Ethan's voice came from across the room, low and even. "It's okay," Sarah said. She looked at Noah. Do you know what it means when a person is afraid of someone? Noah considered this with visible seriousness. Like scared. Not just scared. Scared in a way that doesn't go away. Scared in a way where you wake up every morning, and the first thing you feel is the scared before you even remember what you're scared of. Noah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Did he hurt you? Yes. Did he hurt Lily? I was going to, Sarah said. So I left before he could. Noah looked down at the table. His jaw worked for a moment, in that way. Children's jaws do, when they are processing something that their vocabulary isn't quite large enough to contain. Then he looked up. My pa wouldn't do that, he said. It was not bragging. It was a 9-year-old placing something carefully on the record. I know, Sarah said. And she did know. That was the thing about Ethan Walker. You knew it almost immediately, the same way you knew the weight of good wood versus bad, just by resting your hand on it. There was a quality to him that was entirely and obviously decent, not in a performed way, but in the structural way of a person for whom decency was simply the material they were made of. Your pa is a good man, she said. The best. Noah agreed and went back to his breakfast with the matter-closed certainty of someone who had just confirmed a thing he already knew. Ethan across the room was very focused on the harness hook he was repairing. The letter arrived that afternoon. Gerald Holtz, the neighboring rancher, a wide, sunburned man with kind eyes and the careful way of moving that big men sometimes developed, so as not to make others uncomfortable, brought it himself, rather than leaving it at the road. He came in when Ethan called and held the envelope out with an expression that said clearly he'd rather not be delivering it. Came through the postmaster this morning, Gerald said. Posted from Harlow Creek. Ethan took the envelope. He looked at it for a moment before opening it, and Sarah, watching from the kitchen doorway with Lily in her arms, felt the floor shift slightly under her feet. Ethan read the letter. His expression did not change. Not a muscle, not a flicker. And that careful stillness was in some ways worse than any visible reaction would have been, because it told her the letter was exactly what she'd feared. What does it say? She asked. He handed it to her. It was written in Thomas's hand. She would have known it anywhere, that precise, controlled script that looked perfectly reasonable on paper, which was the whole point. To Mr. Ethan Walker. It has come to my attention that my wife Sarah Vance may be residing on your property. Sarah is not well. She left our home in a state of confusion and distress and took our infant daughter Lily without my knowledge or consent. I am not a man who looks for trouble, but I am a man who will not abandon his family to the charity of strangers. I will be coming to collect my wife and daughter within the fortnight. I hope we can settle this matter quietly between gentlemen without involving the law. Thomas Vance. Sarah read it twice. Then she handed it back to Ethan. Between gentlemen, she said. I noticed that part, Ethan said. He's not coming to settle anything. He's giving you warning so you have time to hand us over before it becomes official. I understand what he's doing. Gerald shifted his weight. Ethan, I gotta say Vance has got friends on the council. If he comes here with paper, then he'll come with paper, Ethan said. His voice was perfectly level. Go ahead and say what you came to say, Gerald. Gerald looked genuinely uncomfortable. I'm not saying he's right. Lord knows the man's got a reputation that sits different when you look close. But he's got resources, and you've got a ranch and a boy and a situation that folks are already starting to talk about. He looked briefly at Sarah with something that was not unkindness, but was also not quite comfort. People are saying things, around town. What kind of things? Sarah said. Gerald paused. Gerald, Ethan said. They're saying she ran off with another man's baby. They're saying... He started again. They're saying she might not be right in the head, that you took her in without knowing what you were taking in. The kitchen was very quiet. Sarah stood absolutely still because she had known this was coming. She had known it the way you know a particular winter, coming in your bones before the temperature drops, and knowing it had not made it feel any less like standing on the receiving end of a thing thrown hard. Gerald, Ethan said. Yeah. Is that what you believe? A pause. No. Then that's the only part that matters to me. You can go on home. Gerald put his hat back on. At the door, he stopped. Vance has got 2 men riding with him when he travels, just so you know. I appreciate that, Ethan said. The door closed. Sarah let out a breath she'd been holding since the envelope arrived. She felt Lily shift in her arms, and she held her tighter, without thinking the reflex of a mother whose body had wired itself to the task of keeping something safe. He's going to come here, and he's going to say I'm unstable, she said. He's going to say I stole her. He has a legal right to her, Ethan, as her father. The law. The law says a lot of things, Ethan said. It also says a man who drove his wife across 4 days of Montana wilderness with a sick baby, trying to get away from him, ought to have some questions asked of him. But who's going to ask them? The town already. Sarah. He said her name for the first time, and it stopped her mid-sentence, not because it was sharp, but because it was deliberate, the way a man says a name when he wants you to hear him clearly. Look at me. She looked at him. I know what it is to have people decide what the story is before they've heard it, he said. I know what it costs to stand in front of that. And I'm not going to tell you it's easy, because it isn't. But I want you to hear me when I say this. I am not going to hand you back to a man who wrote you a letter like that. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. You don't know me well enough to make that promise, she said carefully. I know you well enough, he said. I've been watching you for 4 days. Watching me. The way you are with Lily. The way you are with Noah. The way you get up before dawn and go to bed last, and don't ask for a single thing you haven't already offered something for. I know enough. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at Lily. Then she said very quietly, Thomas is going to make this very hard for you. Let him try, Ethan said. It was not bluster. That was the thing. It had none of the quality of a man performing bravery for an audience. It was simply the statement of a man who had evaluated a situation, made a decision, and communicated that decision in the fewest words necessary. Sarah nodded once. She went back to the mending. But something had changed in the room. Something had been said out loud that made the arrangement between them concrete in a way that it hadn't been before. An arrangement that neither of them named and neither of them retreated from. The week that followed was the strangest of Sarah's life. In this particular way, it was calm. Not the false calm of before, the kind she'd lived with in Thomas's house, where calm meant he was in a good mood, and the specific quality of that calm told you exactly how long it was likely to last. This was a different kind. The kind that came from a place that was simply quiet because it chose to be. Because the people in it had agreed without saying so, that peace was something worth building with their hands. She fixed the fence line along the east paddock with Ethan on Wednesday, handing him tools while he worked, and noticing that he explained what he was doing without being asked. Not in a condescending way, but in the way a person shares knowledge, because they believe the other person is worth sharing it with. Noah came and went, depositing opinions about the fence's previous state with the confidence of someone who has a personal grudge against it. It's been broken since last fall, Noah said. I told Pa we should fix it then. You did not, Ethan said. I thought it very loudly. Sarah laughed. It surprised her the laugh came up before she could measure it or edit it the way real laughter does. She hadn't done that in a while. The sound surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Ethan, who glanced at her with something brief and genuine in his expression before returning to the fence. On Thursday, 2 women from the nearest town, Rosie Callahan and her sister Bet, came by in a wagon. They were ostensibly making a delivery of flour to Gerald, who lived on the road past Ethan's property. But they stopped with too much deliberateness for it to be entirely accidental, and they knocked on the door with the particular energy of women who have come to form an opinion. Ethan answered the door. He looked at them. He said, "Morning." "Morning, Ethan," Rosie said, managing to look both polite and deeply curious simultaneously. "We heard you had some company." "I've got a woman and her daughter staying here while some things get sorted out," Ethan said. His voice carried no apology and no explanation beyond what he'd already given. Is Mrs. Vance?" "She's inside. She doesn't need visitors right now." "We only wanted to—" "I appreciate you coming by," Ethan said with a finality that was entirely pleasant and entirely closed. He did not move from the doorway. Rosie and Bet exchanged a look that contained approximately 400 words, then said their goodbyes and got back in the wagon. Sarah had watched from the inside, keeping back from the window, because she'd learned early that being seen looking out a window when people came calling had a way of confirming whatever narrative they'd already arrived with. When Ethan came back inside, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" "Turn them away like that. You could have just let them look, satisfied their curiosity. It might have helped." Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee. "Or it might not have," he said. "Women like Rosie Callahan don't come to look. They come to collect. Everything they saw would have been material." "You think I couldn't handle it?" He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "I think you've been handling things on your own for a long time," he said. "I'm not turning them away because you can't handle it. I'm turning them away because you shouldn't have to right now." She didn't have an answer for that. She went back to the bread she was making and tried not to examine too closely the feeling that had settled in her chest, because she wasn't sure she had a category for it yet, and she was not the kind of person who was comfortable with uncategorized feelings. The second letter arrived on Saturday. This one was not from Thomas. It was from a man named Clement Bradley, who identified himself as Thomas Vance's lawyer, and its tone was considerably less gentlemanly than the first. It stated in precise legal language that must have taken Bradley some hours to compose, and some additional hours to feel satisfied with that. Thomas Vance had filed a claim with the county sheriff's office for the return of his daughter Lily Vance, who had been removed from the marital home without the father's consent. It further stated that the woman currently identified as Sarah Vance was to be considered an unstable influence, that medical testimony could be produced as to her mental and emotional state, and that Mr. Walker was hereby advised that harboring a woman who had committed there was the word there, it was in ink committed an act that could be construed as child removal, would expose him to legal liability. Ethan read it standing at the kitchen table. Then he folded it precisely and set it down and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at a thing you're deciding how to handle. "He found a lawyer fast," Sarah said. "He had one ready," Ethan said. "Man like that doesn't write a first letter like that one, unless he's already got the second one loaded." "Medical testimony," Sarah said. The words tasted like something cold. "He's going to have someone say I'm not capable. That's how he's going to do it." "Who?" "Dr. Marsh, in Harlow Creek. Thomas plays cards with him every second Thursday. They've been friends for 15 years. She sat down. Her hands were steady, and she was grateful for that, because the rest of her was not entirely steady. I thought if it ever came to something legal, I would just tell the truth. Just say what happened. And I thought that would be enough. It might still be enough. Not against a lawyer and a doctor and a councilman." Ethan sat down across from her. He leaned forward with his forearms on the table, and he looked at her in that direct way. He had the way that didn't offer false comfort, but also didn't retreat from the difficulty. "You said earlier," he said, "that someone knew. When you were talking about what Thomas did before you left, you said someone knew." Sarah went still. "You said he threatened me before, and then you stopped. Like you were going to say someone saw it." She had not remembered saying that. Or she had remembered saying it and decided he wouldn't catch the threat of it. "There was a midwife," she said carefully. "Margaret Hayes. She delivered Lily. She saw things. She asked me questions afterward when Thomas had gone out of the room, and I wasn't ready to say anything. I wasn't—" She stopped. "I don't know if she'd come forward. She's older. She lives quietly. Getting involved in something like this would cost her. But she saw." "Yes." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "We need to find her. Thomas will have thought of her too, if she was there. Then we need to find her before he does." Sarah looked at him. "Ethan, this is not your problem. What Thomas is threatening you with, the legal liability, the reputation, none of that is something you signed on for when you opened your door." "No," he agreed. "I signed on for it when I told you we'd deal with it." She opened her mouth and then closed it, because there was no argument available to her that would move this man once he'd made up his mind. And she was beginning to understand that about him, not as a flaw, but as the simple fact of his character, which had apparently been constructed in a way that didn't leave exits built in once a position had been taken. "Noah's going to overhear us," she said instead. "Noah's out at the barn." She nodded slowly. "Margaret Hayes. She lives outside of Millard, I think. It's 2 days' ride." "I can be there and back in 4 days. You'd leave the ranch. Gerald will keep an eye on things. You'd leave me here alone." He looked at her. "Can you manage 4 days?" It was not a patronizing question. It was a logistical one. "Yes," she said. "But Ethan." She waited until she was sure she had his full attention. "If you go looking for Margaret Hayes and Thomas finds out, and he will find out because Thomas always finds out, you will have moved from being a man who gave shelter to a confused woman, which is defensible, to being a man who is actively working against him. That changes what he does to you, legally and otherwise." Ethan held her gaze. "Then I better leave in the morning." She pressed her lips together. It was not quite a smile, and it was not quite not a smile. "You are either very brave," she said, "or very stubborn." "My wife said those were the same thing," Ethan said. And then something moved across his face. Brief, private, the passage of a particular pain, and he looked back down at the letter. "I'm going to write back to this lawyer. Tell him we'll be seeking our own counsel. That'll slow them down." "We don't have counsel. He doesn't know that." This time, she did almost smile. Noah came back in from the barn, then tracking hay, and the efficient chaos of a 9-year-old who has been doing something productive and wants credit for it. He stopped when he saw their faces. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing you need to worry about," Ethan said. Noah looked at the letter on the table. He looked at Sarah. He looked at his father. Sarah had noticed an almost uncanny ability to read rooms that was simultaneously impressive and inconvenient. "Is it about her husband?" Noah said. "Noah. Because Gerald told his wife, and his wife told me when she brought the pie last Thursday." Noah sat down at the table with the composure of someone delivering a briefing. "She said her husband was coming. She said he had lawyers. She said some people in town are going to take his side." He paused. "I told Mrs. Gerald that I thought those people were wrong." Ethan stared at his son for a long moment. "You told Margaret Holtz that." "I told her very politely," Noah said. "I said it's wrong to take the side of a man who scared a baby so bad her mama had to carry her across the whole state to get away from him. I said that seemed like the kind of thing a decent person should understand." He looked at Sarah. "Did I say it right?" Sarah felt something happen in the back of her throat that she refused to let turn into tears, because she had been doing very well on that front, and she was not going to lose ground now. "You said it exactly right," she managed. Noah nodded, satisfied. "Good." He reached for an apple from the bowl on the table. "Pa, are we going to fight for them?" The question landed in the kitchen, the way certain questions do, with the full and undecorated weight of its simplicity. Ethan looked at his son. Sarah watched Ethan's face and saw the thing in it that she had been seeing for days, now that quality of a man who felt things fully and expressed them sparingly and meant everything he said precisely as much as he meant it. "Yeah," Ethan said. "We are." Noah took a bite of his apple. "Good," he said again. "I already told Mrs. Gerald that." The night before, Ethan left for Millard. Sarah sat on the porch long after the house had gone quiet. The Montana sky was doing what it did best in summer, spreading itself out in every direction, in a way that made you feel simultaneously very small and strangely resolved, like the scale of the thing. Put your problems in a perspective that wasn't diminishing, but clarifying. She heard the door. Ethan came out and stood at the porch railing, not too close, with the natural instinct of a man who understood that a woman sitting alone on a porch after dark might want company or might want quiet, and the correct response was to make yourself available without assuming. "Can't sleep," he said. It was not a question. "No." He leaned on the railing and looked out at the dark. "Me neither." They sat in the not-quite silence of a Montana night wind distance, the occasional sound from the barn for a while without speaking, and Sarah found that she did not feel compelled to fill it, which was itself information, Because she had always filled silences in Thomas's house, driven by the instinct that silence was dangerous, that what he was thinking in silence was worse than anything that might come from words. "Tell me about Clara," she said. She felt him still slightly. Then he let out a long, slow breath. "She was patient," he said. "More patient than I was. I was angry young, about things that didn't deserve the anger." A pause. "She had a way of just waiting it out. Not like she was afraid of me. More like she knew something I didn't. That it would pass. That I'd get there." "Did you get there?" "Eventually, too slowly, but yes." Another pause. "She would have liked you." Sarah looked at him. He was still looking out at the dark. "Because you don't wait things out," he said. "You walk toward them, with a baby in your arms and no shoes worth mentioning, and 4 days of Montana sun on your back. She would have respected that." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your son is like her, I think. The patience." Ethan laughed, a short, real sound that she had not heard from him before. "Lord, I hope not. I put her through enough." "He's also like you. The stubbornness. The decency." Ethan turned and looked at her for a moment. In the dark, his face was mostly shadow, but she could see the directness of his eyes. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't give me credit I haven't earned yet. I've made it 1 week. 1 letter. Come back to me after the next part, and then we'll see." Sarah looked at him. "You're worried you'll flinch." A long pause. "I'm worried about a lot of things," he said finally. "I'm not," Sarah said, and surprised herself by meaning it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened from the railing. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll be back in 4 days." He went inside. Sarah stayed on the porch a while longer, looking at the sky, holding on to the fact of him the way she had learned to hold on to concrete things in the years when concrete things were scarce. He was going to ride 2 days to find an old woman who might or might not be willing to come forward against a man with lawyers and money and 15 years of local reputation. He was going to do it because he'd said he would. Because as far as she could determine, when Ethan Walker said a thing, he said it once, and then he did it. She went inside. She checked on Lily. She lay down on the narrow bed in the small room with the window facing the barn, and listened to the windmill and the dark and the breathing of her daughter. And for the first time in longer than she could count, she slept without listening for the sound of footsteps in the hall. Ethan left before sunrise. Sarah heard him, the particular sound of a man moving through a house with the intention of not waking anyone, which meant bootsteps slowed down and doors eased shut and the stove left cold because starting it would be too loud. She lay in the dark and listened to it and did not get up because she understood instinctively that he needed to leave cleanly without a goodbye, that either of them would have to navigate. She heard the horse. She heard it move away from the barn. Then she heard nothing, and the nothing had a specific quality to it. The quality of a house that had 1 fewer person in it than it had had the night before. Noah knew before he came downstairs. He stood at the bottom of the staircase in his bare feet and looked at the empty hooks where Ethan's riding coat and saddlebag usually hung, and his face went through something quick and private that he covered fast, the way children of single parents learn to cover things fast because they've understood early that someone has to be steady. "He left," Noah said. "He'll be back in 4 days," Sarah said. "He told you last night." "I know." Noah looked at the hooks for another moment. Then he sat down at the table. "He always does this. When something is hard, he goes toward it. Mama said it was his best quality and his most inconvenient one." Sarah set the coffee down in front of him. She'd made it the way she'd seen Ethan make it, which Noah had informed her earlier in the week was the correct way, and all other methods were inferior, and she sat across from him. She was right on both counts, Sarah said. Noah wrapped both hands around the cup, a gesture so precisely like his father's that it pulled at something in her chest. "What happens if the man comes while Pa's gone?" "Then I handle it." Noah looked up. "By yourself. I've been handling things by myself for a while now," Sarah said. "Your father will be back before Thomas gets here. He's not going to ride from Harlow Creek without sending another letter first. That's how he operates. He announces himself so he can watch people get scared before he arrives." Are you scared? The question was direct in the way Noah's questions always were, carrying no judgment, just genuine curiosity about the answer. Yes, Sarah said. But being scared and being beaten are different things. Noah considered this with the focused seriousness he brought to most things. Pa says the same thing, he said. Almost exactly. Maybe your father and I think alike about some things. Maybe, Noah said. Then, with a 9-year-old's complete absence of awareness that this observation might land with any particular weight. Mama would have liked you. Pa doesn't bring people inside. You're the first person he's brought inside in 3 years. Sarah looked at him. What do you mean? People come to the door. Ranchers, townspeople, Gerald. Pa talks to them on the porch or at the fence. He doesn't... Noah paused, searching for the right word. He doesn't let people in. The inside of the house is just us. He picked up his coffee cup. Until you. Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at her hands on the table. I didn't exactly give him a choice, she said finally. He always has a choice, Noah said with a certainty that was not argumentative but simply factual. Pa just made a different one this time. The first day without Ethan was long in the way of days when you are waiting for something you can't see coming. Sarah kept herself busy with the methodical intensity of a woman who knew that idle hands led to idle thoughts, and idle thoughts in her current situation led nowhere useful. She fixed the chicken coop latch that had been sticking since she'd arrived. She churned butter. She got Noah started on the math work that Ethan had apparently been conducting intermittently between ranch tasks, which Noah submitted to with moderate grace, and only 2 complaints about the irrelevance of fractions to actual life. When? Noah said, pencil hovering over the paper. Will I ever need to know what 3/8 of 48 is? When you're splitting something 3 ways, and one part needs to be bigger than the others, Sarah said without looking up from the bread she was kneading. Noah stared at the paper. 18, he said. Correct. I still think it's unnecessary. Your father thinks it's necessary. Noah sighed the sigh of someone who has decided to yield the field for now. Pa thinks a lot of things are necessary. Most of them probably are. Gerald Holtz came by mid-morning. He came in and stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has been sent by his wife to do something he wasn't entirely sure how to execute. Margaret wanted me to check on you, he said. I'm fine, Sarah said. Thank you. She also wanted me to say... He stopped, started again. She wanted you to know that not everybody in this valley thinks what some people are saying. About you. About Ethan. He turned his hat brim through his fingers. Margaret's got a sharp tongue, and she uses it on people who deserve it, and she's been using it on some of the talk going around. Sarah looked at him. What talk specifically? Gerald's jaw shifted. People saying Ethan had no business taking you in. That you're another man's wife. That it doesn't look proper. And Mrs. Holtz disagrees. Margaret says any woman who walks 4 days through Montana summer with a sick baby and not enough shoes was running from something real. He met her eyes. She says she'd have done the same thing in your position. She says Ethan did the right thing, and people who say otherwise don't know Ethan, or they don't know Thomas Vance well enough. Does she know Thomas Vance? Gerald's expression shifted into something more careful. He came through here 3 years back trying to expand the store operation, was looking to buy out the Harrison property. Spent 2 weeks in the valley, very charming, very friendly. He paused. The Harrisons sold him the contract rights and then found 6 months later that the contract meant something different than they'd understood. They lost most of what they'd expected to gain. Thomas said it was their misreading of the document. A beat. Clement Bradley wrote those documents. Same lawyer who wrote your letter. Sarah set down the bread dough. He's done this before, she said. He's a man who knows how to write things, so they mean what he wants them to mean, and not what you think they mean. Gerald looked uncomfortable. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. No, she said. But you're confirming it. And confirmation matters. After Gerald left, Sarah sat down for the first time all morning. She held Lily, who was alert and bright-eyed, and absolutely unaware that her existence was currently the subject of legal documents in another town, and she looked at her daughter's face and ran through everything Gerald had just said. Thomas had a pattern. That was what it amounted to. He found vulnerable people, the Harrisons her eventually. Lily and he used language and appearance, and the enormous social advantage of being a credible, well-dressed, soft-spoken man in a world that extended enormous trust to credible, well-dressed, soft-spoken men. And he arranged things so that when it went wrong, the wrong had already been built into the paperwork, and the only thing left was for the other person to discover it. She had been his greatest project. 4 years of it. And she had finally stopped being a project and started being a person again. Somewhere in the middle of 4 days of Montana summer with a sick baby and not enough shoes. She was not going back. She started going through the books on the shelf. Not idly, purposefully, because Ethan had a copy of the Montana Territorial Statutes from 1879 tucked between a farming almanac and a collection of sermons, and she pulled it out and read it with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the best way to fight a man who uses legal language as a weapon is to understand the weapon. She read for 3 hours while Lily slept, and Noah did chores. What she found both helped and frightened her. A father's legal right to his children was, as she'd feared, substantial. The law had been written by men who assumed the father was the primary stakeholder in the family enterprise, and that the mother's role was largely supplementary to that claim. But there were provisions, small careful provisions, written in language so restrained. It almost apologized for existing, that allowed for the removal of a child from a father's custody in cases of demonstrated threat to the child's welfare. Demonstrated. That was the word. It required demonstration, evidence, witnesses. It required someone like Margaret Hayes. She was still sitting with the book open in her lap when Noah came in from the barn, looked at what she was reading, and sat down across from her with the directness that was becoming his most consistent quality. "Are you trying to figure out how to win?" he said. "I'm trying to figure out what winning looks like," she said. "Pa says those are the same question." She looked at him. "Your father says a lot of things that turn out to be right." "I know," Noah said without a trace of smugness. "Just fact." "Is there anything in there about fathers who are bad?" Sarah looked at the page. "There's a little," she said. "Not enough, but a little." "Then we work with a little," Noah said. He said it so exactly the way Ethan would have said it that Sarah had to look away for a moment. It was on the 3rd day that Thomas came early. She had said he would send another letter first. She had said he operated through announcements, through advance pressure, through the carefully engineered dread of anticipation. She had been right about all of that in the past. What she had not accounted for was that his first letter going unanswered for more than a week would shift his calculation. That silence in Thomas Vance's accounting was a form of defiance, and defiance from a woman he considered his property was something he had never learned to tolerate patiently. She heard the horses before she saw them. 3 of them. Thomas in front, riding the gray he'd always preferred because it made him look taller. Clement Bradley beside him dressed for business in the middle of the prairie, which under different circumstances might have struck her as almost funny. A 3rd man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, with the particular carried stillness of someone paid to be physically present when other people needed physical presence. Noah was inside. She thanked God for that. She was on the porch when they came to the gate, and she did not go to meet them. She stood on the porch of Ethan Walker's house, and she kept her feet exactly where they were, because she understood with complete clarity that the first thing Thomas would try to do was make her move, make her come toward him. Step off the porch, enter his radius, because Thomas believed strongly in the psychological advantage of terrain, and he had taught her without meaning to teach her anything useful. That staying put when someone wanted you to move was itself a form of resistance. Thomas dismounted. He looked exactly the same. That was almost the most disturbing part. She had half expected him to look different, to look like what he was, because surely a man who called his infant daughter a liability would carry some outward evidence of it. But Thomas Vance, at 35, still looked like the most reasonable man in any given room. Brown hair neat, not a strand out of place despite the ride. Good coat. Good posture. The smile she had once thought was warm and now understood was practiced. "Sarah," he said. He said her name the way he always had, with just enough softness in it to sound like affection, which she knew had always known. On some level she'd kept locked was performance. "Thomas," she said, "you look well." He came to the foot of the porch steps and stopped there, which meant she was above him, which she suspected he had not intended. "I was worried about you." "Were you?" "Of course I was. You left without a word, Sarah. You took our daughter and walked off in the middle of the night. What was I supposed to think?" "I imagine you thought exactly what you always think," Sarah said. "That the problem was me and not you." The smile didn't waver. Behind him, Bradley pulled out a document case. The third man stayed on his horse. "I'm not here to fight," Thomas said. "I'm here to bring my family home." "I'm not your family anymore. The law says differently." He glanced up and around, taking in the ranch with the evaluating look of a man who was currently calculating its worth as a liability or an asset. "Where's Walker?" "Not here." Something moved through Thomas's face so fast she almost missed its satisfaction. He had timed this. Of course he had. He had sent the letters and counted the days, and assessed that a man who received those letters would likely go looking for whatever he thought might help him, and he had planned to arrive in that window. "Well," Thomas said pleasantly, "then I suppose we can settle this quietly the way I'd prefer." "There's nothing to settle, Sarah." The softness in his voice sharpened just slightly, just enough to carry the reminder of what that sharpening had historically meant. "Lily is my daughter. You know that. The law knows that. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not making it anything," Sarah said. "I'm standing on a man's porch and I'm asking you to leave." Bradley stepped forward. He had the document case open now, and he was holding papers with the practiced ease of a man who used paper the way other men used fists. "Mrs. Vance, I have here a writ from the county." "You can hold that right where it is," said a voice from the gate. Everyone turned. Gerald Holtz had come up the road without any of them noticing him. He had that particular quality of large, quiet men who moved without announcing themselves, and he was standing at the gate with his arms folded, and the look of a man who had decided some time ago that he was going to be somewhere when needed, and was now being somewhere when needed. "Gerald," Thomas said, adjusting his tone immediately to something more collegial. "I didn't realize you had an interest in this situation." "Neighbor's situation is my situation," Gerald said. "That's how it works out here, maybe different in town. This is between me and my wife." "I don't think she's indicating she's your wife anymore," Gerald said. "And I don't think Ethan Walker's property is the right place to be conducting whatever this is." He looked at Sarah. "You all right?" "Fine," Sarah said. "Good." Gerald looked back at Thomas. "You want to serve papers, you do it with the sheriff present and with Walker present. That's how things happen proper." Thomas looked at Gerald for a moment with the specific expression of a man recalibrating, and then the smile came back, the practiced one, and he turned back to Sarah. "I'll give you until the end of the week," he said. "I'll come back with the sheriff. I hope by then you've had a chance to think clearly about what's best for Lily." "I've been thinking clearly about what's best for Lily since before she was born," Sarah said. "That's why I'm here and not there." Thomas held her gaze for 3 seconds. She did not look away. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back down the road with Bradley and the third man behind him. Sarah did not move from the porch until the horses were entirely out of sight. Then she sat down on the top porch step because her legs had decided they'd done enough. Gerald came through the gate and up to the porch. He sat down on the step below her. "He'll be back Friday," he said. "I know. With the sheriff. I know. Ethan won't be back until Thursday," Sarah said. "I know. I've done the math 6 times this morning." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then, "You didn't flinch." "I was flinching on the inside." "Don't matter where," Gerald said. "Matters what he saw." He looked at where the road had been. "Thomas Vance expected you to be scared. Expected you to fall apart without Walker here. You didn't. That's going to bother him." "Good," Sarah said. "Let it bother him." She heard the door behind her. Noah stood in the doorway with Lily in his arms. He'd gotten competent at holding her over the past week, with the solemn responsibility of a child who'd been given an important task and taken it seriously. "Was that him?" Noah said. "Yes." "What did he want?" Same thing he always wants, to make me believe I don't have a choice. Noah looked at her with those direct eyes. But you do. Yes, Sarah said. I do. She went inside, and she sat down at the table, and she wrote a letter. She wrote it to the county clerk of courts, citing the provisions she'd found in the territorial statutes, requesting that any hearing regarding custody of the minor child, Lily Vance, be postponed, pending the procurement of additional witness testimony. She wrote it in the most precise language she could manage, going back to the statute book twice to make sure she was using the correct terms. It was not lawyering. It was a woman with a book and a need. But it was something. She gave the letter to Gerald to post. Then she fed Lily, put her down for the afternoon, went back to the kitchen, and started on supper. Noah watched her from his stool. "You're not scared," he said. "I'm terrified," Sarah said, chopping carrots with steady hands. "You don't look it." "That's the point." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that something you learned, or something you always knew?" Sarah thought about it. She thought about 4 years in a house where looking afraid had consequences, and 4 days on a road where looking afraid might have gotten the door closed. She thought about the moment on Ethan's porch just now, when she'd understood that Thomas would read whatever she showed him and use it. "Both," she said finally. "I think I always knew it was possible, and then I had to learn it was necessary." Noah nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd been working out. "I'm going to remember that," he said. The next morning delivered something she hadn't expected. A wagon came up the road before breakfast, driven by a woman Sarah didn't recognize, small, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome when young and was now simply authoritative. The way faces get when the person inside them has stopped caring about being liked and started caring about being right. The woman climbed down from the wagon without assistance and came directly to the porch. She looked at Sarah with eyes that missed very little. "You're the Caldwell girl," she said. "Sarah Caldwell," Sarah confirmed. "Yes." "Margaret Hayes," the woman said. "I delivered your daughter." The name hit Sarah like a hand to the chest. She stood absolutely still in the doorway. "Mr. Walker came to see me," Margaret said. "3 days ago. Told me what happened. Told me what Vance is doing." She looked around the porch, then back at Sarah. "I told him I'd come. I didn't tell him when." "You're early," Sarah managed. "I'm exactly when I decided to be," Margaret said. "Are you going to invite me in, or are we going to stand here in the morning like a couple of fence posts?" Sarah stepped back from the door. Margaret came inside. She looked around the kitchen with the comprehensive attention of a woman who reads houses the way other people read faces. Then she sat down at the table without being invited and folded her hands. "Sit down," she said to Sarah. "I want to hear everything from your own mouth before I decide how to proceed." Sarah sat. Lily in her basket near the stove made a small sound, and Margaret's eyes went to her immediately. The instinctive directness of a woman who had spent 40 years attending to small sounds from infants. "That her?" she said. "Yes." Margaret looked at Lily for a long moment. Something moved through her face, something private and determined. "She looks well," she said. "She nearly wasn't," Sarah said. "No, she nearly wasn't." Margaret looked back at her. "I remember the night she was born. I remember what I saw. I didn't say anything then because you didn't ask me to, and I had no authority to push it." She paused. "I've thought about that night many times in the past 4 months. I've thought about what I should have said that I didn't." Sarah said, "Margaret, what you could have done then, it doesn't matter now. What matters is that I'm here now," Margaret said. "So tell me what he's bringing." Sarah told her everything. The letters, the lawyer, the doctor whose testimony Thomas had already apparently arranged, the sheriff's visit coming on Friday. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of rare. Most people interrupted either with sympathy or with advice. But Margaret Hayes listened the way a woman listened, who knew that the most important thing happening in a room was the thing being said. When Sarah finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Marsh," she said. "Yes." "Edward Marsh." The name came out flat. "He delivered 6 babies in that county before I took over the Eastern Circuit. Lost 3 of them." She looked at Sarah. He knows I know that. And he knows I know other things about the way he operates because we were colleagues for 6 years, and I am a woman who pays attention. Sarah stared at her. What are you saying? I'm saying Thomas Vance picked a doctor to discredit you, whose own credibility is a thing I can speak to directly. Margaret unfolded her hands and set them flat on the table, a gesture that looked like a decision being made physical. I'm saying I've been sitting 60 miles away for 4 months, waiting for a reason to say the things I should have said, and the reason just rode through this town 3 days ago on a gray horse wearing his good coat. From the doorway. Noah, who had apparently come in from the barn at some point during this conversation, and stationed himself there with the practiced stillness of a child who has learned that being invisible sometimes let you hear the most important things said. So you're going to help them? Margaret looked at him. Who are you? Noah Walker. This is my father's house. Where is your father? He went to get you, Noah said. You came before he came back. Margaret looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained the DNA of one. Apparently I did, she said. She looked back at Sarah. Friday, she said. Friday, Sarah confirmed. Then we have 2 days. Margaret reached into the bag she'd set on the table and pulled out a small worn journal. She opened it with the careful habit of a woman who'd been consulting this particular document for many years. I have notes from the night Lily was born. I have notes from 2 weeks prior when I came to examine you and found things that I documented carefully because I am a careful woman. She looked up. Thomas Vance does not know I keep notes. Sarah felt something happen in her chest. Something warm and sudden, like a fire catching in a cold room. He won't expect you, Sarah said slowly. No, he won't. Margaret's voice was entirely steady. He has spent 40 years not expecting women like me. That is, if you'll pardon the language, his problem. The sound of a horse on the road stopped the conversation. Sarah was on her feet before she'd decided to stand, already moving toward the window with the particular alarm of a woman whose nervous system had spent 4 years learning to treat unexpected sounds as threats. Then the horse came through the gate and she recognized the rider. Ethan. A day early. He dismounted faster than she'd ever seen him move, and he was up the porch steps and through the door, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway, looking at the scene in front of him. Sarah, Margaret, Noah, the journal open on the table, and his face went through several things in rapid sequence. You're early, Sarah said. Margaret wasn't home when I got there, he said. He looked at the woman at the table. You rode here yourself. I'm 61 years old, Margaret said. I have been riding myself places for 50 of those years. I don't require assistance. I didn't say you did. You had the face of a man who was going to say it. Ethan looked at Sarah. Something was working in his jaw. He came, Sarah said. Yesterday. Ethan went very still. He came early. He brought Bradley and another man. Gerald was here. He didn't get past the gate. She held his gaze. I held the line. The kitchen was very quiet. Then, Ethan let out a long, slow breath. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent. The breath of a man releasing a tension he'd been carrying for 2 days on a road. Friday, he said. Friday, she said. With the sheriff. And Margaret has her notes. He looked at Margaret. She looked at him with the patient authority of a woman who had delivered approximately 300 children in 40 years and was not impressed by the weight of the moment. Mr. Walker, she said. Ma'am, your woman held the line very well. The silence after that was the particular kind that comes when something is said out loud that everyone in the room has been thinking and nobody was sure how to say. Noah, still in the doorway, looked at the floor. Sarah looked at Ethan. He was looking at her with the expression she was beginning to be able to read, the one he carried when something mattered to him that he was not yet ready to name. His jaw was tight and his eyes were direct, and there was something in them that she did not look away from. She's not my woman, Ethan said quietly. She's her own. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Well, she said, that's a fine distinction. She closed the journal and tucked it back in her bag. Now, who's making supper? Because I've been riding since dawn, and I intend to eat before we plan anything." Noah raised his hand. Margaret looked at him. "Can you actually cook?" "Biscuits," Noah said seriously. "Ma'am, my biscuits are a matter of public record." For the first time since she'd arrived, Margaret Hayes smiled. Outside, the sky was going amber at the edges. Friday was coming. Thomas was coming. The sheriff was coming. Bradley was coming with his documents and his careful language, and his 40 years of helping Thomas Vance make things mean what Thomas wanted them to mean. But inside the Walker kitchen, around a table that had once held only 2 people and now held 4, and would hold more by the end of the week, something was being built that had no legal language for it and needed none. It was just people, deciding together that a thing was worth fighting for. That had always been enough to change things. It would have to be enough now. Noah's biscuits were as advertised extraordinary. Margaret ate 2 of them without comment, which Noah correctly interpreted as the highest form of praise available from a woman who clearly did not dispense compliments as a matter of course. She drank her coffee, ate her supper, and then opened her journal on the table and got to work with the business-like efficiency of someone who had decided that sentiment was a thing you earned after the practical matters were handled. They sat around the table for 3 hours that night. Ethan, Sarah, Margaret. Noah lasted until about the 2nd hour before his head started dropping toward his arms, and Ethan sent him to bed with a hand on his shoulder and no argument from the boy, which told Sarah that Noah understood the room well enough to know that his presence was no longer the point. Margaret read from her notes. She read in the flat, precise voice of a woman trained to observe and record without editorializing, which made the content of the notes land with a specific kind of weight, not dramatized, not softened, just documented. She had visited Sarah 6 weeks before Lily was born. She had noted bruising on Sarah's left arm, upper and lower. She had asked Sarah directly how it had happened, and Sarah had said she'd fallen, which Margaret had also noted, along with her own clinical assessment, that the pattern of bruising was inconsistent with a fall. She had noted that Sarah was underweight for her stage of pregnancy. She had noted that Thomas Vance, present for the first 10 minutes of the visit, had answered several questions on Sarah's behalf before Margaret had redirected the conversation to Sarah alone, at which point Thomas had left the room. She had noted all of this in ink in a journal dated and signed. The night of the birth, she had noted more. Ethan listened with his hands flat on the table and his face very still. Sarah listened and felt the strange dual experience of hearing her own history read back to her in clinical language, how it was both more and less than living. How the words both captured something true and failed entirely to capture the weight of it. When Margaret finished, she closed the journal. "That's what I have," she said. "It's enough," Ethan said. "It might be enough," Sarah said carefully. "Against a different man. Thomas has Dr. Marsh lined up. Marsh will say that I showed signs of instability during the pregnancy. He'll say the birth was complicated by my emotional state. He'll frame everything Margaret has as the observations of a woman who misread a situation." "Let him try to impeach my observations," Margaret said with a flatness that was almost frightening. "He'll try," Sarah said. "Thomas always tries, and he's good at it. He'll make the judge look at you and see an elderly woman with a grudge, and he'll make the judge look at me and see exactly what he's always said. I was confused. Emotional, someone who makes problems where there aren't any." "Then you need to be the opposite of that on Friday," Ethan said. "I know. Not just composed, not just credible. You need to be the person in that room who sounds the least like what he's going to say you are." Sarah looked at him. "You've thought about this?" "The whole ride back," he said. 2 days on a horse with nothing but the problem. And the way Thomas wins is by making this about you," Ethan said. "Your state of mind, your stability, your version of events against his. If it stays there, he has the doctor, the lawyer, and 15 years of reputation. If it gets off that ground. If it becomes about him," Sarah said slowly. "About the pattern," Margaret said. She was nodding. "The Harrison contract. I know about that. Are there others?" "There was a man named Porter," Sarah said. "Before we were married. Thomas arranged some kind of land deal that Porter ended up losing on. Thomas said it was Porter's mistake." She paused. "And there was something with a woman Thomas employed at the store. She left after 6 months, and Thomas said she was unreliable. I always wondered about that. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I know a man in Harlow Creek, he said. Jim Cottrell. He worked for Thomas briefly before I met Clara. He told me once, just once, and then never mentioned it again, that Thomas had done something that cost Jim's brother a season's revenue. Jim's brother blamed himself for years. He looked at Sarah. Is there any chance Jim would talk about Thomas? About the pattern? Sarah looked at the table. She was running calculations, the same kind she'd been running for days, the kind that had to account for Thomas's reach, his preparedness, his capacity to turn testimony against the person giving it. There's a chance, she said. Jim's brother died 3 years ago. Jim's got nothing left to protect from Thomas. Then I ride to Harlow Creek tomorrow morning, Ethan said. Ethan. Sarah looked at him directly. You cannot be gone Thursday. I'll be back by nightfall Thursday. You said that about Margaret. And I was right about Margaret. She's here. Margaret, who had been listening to this with the attention of a spectator at a chess match, looked between them. He's right that the pattern matters, she said. A judge who sees one woman making claims against a respectable man sees a domestic dispute. A judge who sees 3 people with 3 different stories that all point the same direction sees a character. Thomas will know what we're doing, Sarah said. If Jim Cottrell shows up, if Margaret shows up. Good, Ethan said. Let him know. Let him spend Thursday rearranging his case instead of building it forward. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You're not a cautious man. I'm plenty cautious, he said. About the right things. And this isn't one of them. Caution doesn't win Friday, he said. Being more prepared than he is wins Friday. Margaret closed her journal and put it back in her bag. I'm going to sleep, she said with the air of a woman who had evaluated the situation, found the people in it capable, and decided her contribution for the evening was complete. The bed you put me in, it's the small room off the hall. Yes, ma'am, Ethan said. Good. She stood. Mr. Walker. Ma'am. You ride to Harlow Creek in the morning. You get Jim Cottrell if he'll come. She looked at Sarah. And you sleep tonight. Because you're going to need to be exactly yourself on Friday, which means you cannot be hollow-eyed and running on no sleep. The judge is going to look at you and decide in the first 30 seconds whether you're the woman Thomas says you are. Don't give him reason to hesitate. She went down the hall, her door closed. Sarah looked at Ethan. She's remarkable. She's terrifying, Ethan said. Same thing, Sarah said. He almost smiled. Then he looked at the table, and the almost smile folded back into the thing underneath it, which was the same focused weight he carried when something mattered. Sarah. Don't, she said quietly. Don't what? Don't tell me it's going to be fine. I know you believe it. I know you believe it the way you believe most things completely, because you don't leave room for the alternative. But I need to sit with the fact that it might not be fine. I need to hold that so I'm not surprised by it. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. I won't say it. Thank you, but I'll say this. He looked at her, and his eyes had that directness that she'd stopped flinching from somewhere in the second week. The directness of a man who said what he meant, and meant what he said, and found the alternative a waste of everyone's time. Whatever happens Friday, you are not going back to that house. Whatever the judge rules, whatever paper Thomas brings, whatever Marsh says about your state of mind, you are not going back there. So if the legal path closes, we find another path. That's not optimism. That's just a fact I need you to understand. Sarah looked at him. Her throat was doing something she was managing carefully. That's a very large promise. I know what it is, he said. You've known me 3 weeks. I know enough, he said. Same as I said before. She held his gaze, and she believed him. Not because she was naive, not because she needed to believe it, but because 3 weeks of watching Ethan Walker had given her a reliable data set, and every entry in it said the same thing about this man. Okay, she said finally. Okay. He nodded. He stood and took the coffee cups to the basin. Then he said without turning around, Get some sleep. You too. I'll sleep when Friday's done. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to Lily breathe, and ran the whole thing through her mind once carefully, like checking a structure for weak points. Then she made herself stop, because Margaret was right, and she knew it. She slept. Thursday moved like a held breath. Ethan left at first light, the way he seemed to do everything without ceremony already in motion before the moment was fully formed. Sarah heard the horse and lay still for 30 seconds, telling herself she was not going to spend the day watching the road, then got up and started the stove, because keeping her hands busy was the only real medicine she had. Margaret came out of her room fully dressed at 6, which implied she had never been the kind of woman who required time to assemble herself. "He's gone," she said. "An hour ago." "Good." Margaret sat down. "Tell me about the judge." "His name is Herbert Cole. He's been on the bench 12 years. He's not corrupt, I don't think. He's just—" Sarah paused, searching for the right word. "He's the kind of man who believes he's fair because he applies the law evenly without accounting for the fact that the law was written by people like Thomas." Margaret nodded slowly. "Respects decorum." "Extremely. Then you dress simply, and you speak plainly, and you do not cry." Margaret said it without unkindness, just as fact. "Tears read as instability to men, like Herbert Cole. Even if the tears are entirely justified, even if they are the only reasonable human response to the situation, he will file them under the category Thomas has already labeled you with." "I know," Sarah said. "I learned not to cry in front of Thomas a long time ago." Something moved through Margaret's face at that brief fierce, the passing of an anger she had long practiced containing. "I know you did," she said quietly. They spent the morning going through what Sarah would say. Margaret asked her questions the way a harsh questioner would, pressing skeptical, looking for the places where Sarah's account wobbled, or where her emotion got ahead of her language. Sarah answered them. Margaret pushed. Sarah answered again. It was uncomfortable and necessary, and by midday, Sarah felt a different kind of tired than she had in the morning, the tired of someone who has used the right muscles. Noah sat on his stool and listened, and occasionally quietly handed someone a cup of water, which was his way of being useful in a situation where he understood his role was to be present without being prominent. At one point, Margaret asked, "When Thomas told you Lily was a liability, were you alone?" "Yes." "So it's your word?" "Yes." "Then you don't lead with that," Margaret said. "That's the thing you have least evidence for, and Thomas will call it fabricated. You lead with what I saw. You lead with what Jim Cottrell saw if Ethan brings him. You let the pattern speak first, and then the worst thing. Thomas said becomes the thing the judge can imagine him saying, because by then the judge already understands who Thomas is." Sarah stared at her. "You've done this before." "Not in a courthouse," Margaret said. "But I've been in rooms where a woman needed to be believed, and the person responsible for believing her had already been told not to. Yes, I've done this before." "What happened in those rooms?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes it worked," she said. "Sometimes it didn't." She met Sarah's eyes. "But the ones where it worked, it was never because the woman was perfect, or because the evidence was overwhelming. It was because she was present. Because she was there in that room being entirely and undeniably herself, and the story they'd told about her simply couldn't survive contact with the actual person." Sarah absorbed that. "Be yourself," she said. "Be every bit of yourself," Margaret said. "The parts Thomas tried to make you ashamed of. The part that walked 4 days through Montana summer. The part that knocked on a stranger's door. The part that's been sitting at this table for 3 weeks building a case instead of hiding from one." She leaned forward slightly. "That woman, that specific woman, is not the woman Thomas Vance is going to describe on Friday. And if you're fully present, Judge Cole is going to have to reconcile those two people." Noah from his stool said, "She's good." "Yes," Sarah said. "She is." Ethan came back at 4 in the afternoon, and he was not alone. Jim Cottrell was a lean, sun-dried man in his mid-50s, with the look of someone who had spent a long time carrying something and had recently decided to set it down. He came into the kitchen with his hat already in his hands and looked at Sarah with eyes that held no judgment. Just recognition, the recognition of one person who had been through something for another. Mrs. Vance, he said. Then, or Miss Caldwell, I suppose, is how you'd prefer it. Sarah is fine, she said. Jim Cottrell nodded. He sat down when Margaret gestured to the chair across from her. He looked at the journal she placed on the table. He looked at Sarah. I'll tell you what I told Ethan on the road, he said. Thomas Vance cost my brother Randall 4 years of his life and every dollar he'd saved since he was 20 years old. Randall never recovered from it. Spent the last 3 years of his life believing he'd made the mistake, because that's what Thomas told him and what Thomas told everyone else, and because Randall couldn't prove different. He paused. Randall died 2 years ago. Heart gave out. I don't think the heart had much left to give. He looked at his hat brim. I've got nothing to protect anymore, and I've been waiting a long time for someone to give me a room to say it in. The kitchen was very quiet. You understand, Ethan said, that Bradley will go at you hard. Clement Bradley wrote the contract that ruined my brother, Jim said. I know exactly how Bradley goes at people. I've had a long time to think about what I'd say back. Margaret looked at Jim Cottrell with the evaluating attention she brought to everything. You'll hold up, she said, as if she'd just completed an internal assessment. Yes, ma'am, Jim said. I intend to. That night, the Walker house held more people than it had held in years. Ethan, Sarah, Lily, Noah, Jim, and the extra presents filled the spaces in it, the way warmth fills a house when the fire is built. Right moving into the corners and the cold places until the whole structure holds it. Noah made biscuits again. Jim Cottrell said they were the finest he'd eaten north of the Missouri, which was the moment Noah decided Jim was a person of impeccable judgment. After supper. After Jim had gone to settle in Gerald's guest room for the night, and Margaret had retired. Sarah stood on the porch. She heard the door behind her and did not need to look. Ethan stood at the railing. The night was very dark and very big in the way of Montana nights, the kind of dark that made things feel both exposed and oddly private. You brought him, she said. He was ready to come, Ethan said. I just gave him somewhere to go. You do that a lot, she said. Give people somewhere to go. He was quiet for a moment. It's a ranch. There's always somewhere to be useful. That's not what I mean, and you know it. He said nothing, which meant he knew it. Sarah turned and looked at him. In the dark he was mostly shape, and the pale of his shirt, and the particular way he held himself not guarded exactly, but contained like a man who had learned to take up only as much space as he'd been offered. Ethan, she said. After Friday, whatever happens. She stopped, started again. I need to say this before tomorrow, because tomorrow is going to be, I don't know what it's going to be. But before it I need to say that when I knocked on your door 3 weeks ago, I didn't believe in the kind of person you are. Not because I thought people like you didn't exist, but because I'd spent 4 years being taught not to believe in them. He was looking at her. You changed that, she said. Noah changed it. Even Margaret in 3 days changed it. She looked at him steadily. So whatever happens Friday, you should know that you already changed something. Something real. Something he can't undo. Ethan was quiet for a long time. She could see the working of his jaw in the dark. Sarah, he said. Yes. After Friday. He said the words carefully, the way he said things he'd been holding for a while. I'd like to talk about after Friday. What about it? Whether there's something here. He looked at her directly. Not from obligation, not because of the situation, because... He stopped, and for the first time she saw him search for words in a way that was visible, a man whose usual precision was encountering something that resisted it. Because the house has been different since you came, and not just because there's more people in it. And I'm not. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I'm also not a man who says things before he's sure of them, so I'm not saying it yet. But I wanted you to know, it's a question I'm holding. Sarah looked at him. She felt the weight of it. The specific, careful weight of a man who chose every word because words meant something to him. I'm holding it too, she said. The knight sat around them for a moment. Then, get some sleep, he said. Big day. I know. She went inside. Friday arrived, the way consequential days always did, without any outward indication that it was different from any other. The sun coming up the same color. The ranch sounds the same. Lily awake and demanding in that cheerful, imperious way she'd developed now that she was healthy and understood that her needs were reliably met. Sarah dressed with care. Not to impress Margaret had been clear on the distinction. To present. There was a dress in the bottom of the bag she'd packed the night she left Thomas's house. A gray wool dress that was plain and neat, and was the most herself she could be in fabric form. She put it on. She did her hair simply. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall. She looked like exactly who she was. Margaret came in, looked at her and said, "Good." They arrived at the county seat just before 10. Gerald's wagon held all of them, Ethan and Gerald on the bench, Sarah with Lily, Margaret, Jim in the back with Noah, who had been told he was coming because Gerald's Margaret had pointed out that a 9-year-old boy who knew this family was itself a form of testimony about what kind of people they were. The hearing was not in a formal courthouse. It was in the back room of the land office, which was the largest available interior in a county that hadn't yet built the institutions its growing population required. Judge Cole sat behind a wide desk, a man of about 60, with white side whiskers, and the careful neutral expression of someone who had learned that the appearance of impartiality was itself a kind of currency. Thomas was already there when they arrived. He looked exactly as he always looked, composed, well-dressed. His entire presentation an argument for his credibility. He had Bradley on his left. He had Dr. Marsh, a soft-faced man with pince-nez glasses, on his right. He had 2 other men from Harlow Creek, who Sarah recognized as town council members, sitting against the wall as apparent character witnesses. When Sarah walked in with Ethan beside her, Thomas's eyes moved over the group behind her. Margaret, Jim, Gerald, and she watched his face do the thing it always did when an unexpected variable appeared. The tiny recalibration, the smoothing over, the rapid internal adjustment that never showed on the surface, but that she had learned over years to read in the muscles around his eyes. He had not expected Margaret. He had not expected Jim Cottrell. She did not let herself show that she had noticed him notice. Judge Cole called the room to order. He explained the nature of the proceeding. Not a criminal matter, he was careful to say, but a custody determination under territorial statute. He would hear from both parties. He would review any documentation presented. He would make a preliminary ruling with the option to schedule formal proceedings if the matter required further court time. Bradley went first. He was smooth and organized, and he laid out Thomas's case with the efficiency of a man who had prepared for exactly this audience and knew what it wanted to hear. Thomas Vance, devoted father. Thomas Vance, upstanding citizen. The disappearance of his wife and daughter. Unexpected, distressing, inexplicable to a man of Thomas's obvious stability and care. Dr. Marsh's assessment submitted in writing, noting that Sarah Vance had displayed signs of emotional instability during her pregnancy, that Marsh believed had continued postpartum. Thomas himself spoke briefly and with devastating restraint. He did not attack Sarah. He expressed concern. He expressed loss. He said he simply wanted his daughter safe and his family restored. He was in every visible way the portrait of a man wronged by circumstance rather than complicit in it. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stood up. She felt Ethan behind her, not hovering, not directing, just present a solid fact at her back, and she felt Margaret across the room, and Jim Cottrell and Gerald's steady bulk, and Noah's 9-year-old certainty, and she turned all of that into something she could stand on. She said, "Your Honor, I left my husband because I believed my daughter's life was in danger. I did not leave because I was confused. I did not leave because I was unstable. I left because a man called his 4-month-old daughter a liability, and I understood what that word meant coming from him, because I had been subject to the consequences of his assessments for 4 years." She did not look at Thomas. She looked at the judge. "I would like to present documentation," she said. "From Margaret Hayes, a licensed midwife who attended my pregnancy and my daughter's birth, and who kept notes on what she observed. I would also like to present testimony from James Cottrell of Harlow Creek, who can speak to a pattern of behavior by my husband that is directly relevant to the question of whether Lily is safe in his care." Bradley was on his feet. "Your Honor, These witnesses were not disclosed. "This is a preliminary hearing, Mr. Bradley," Judge Cole said with the patience of a man who had seen lawyers do this before. "Not a trial. Sit down." Bradley sat. Margaret Hayes stood up. She read from her journal. She read in that flat, precise, utterly credible voice dates, observations, clinical assessments, the bruising. She documented the questions Sarah hadn't answered, the things she'd seen and written down, and signed and dated, and kept in a journal that was now open on Judge Cole's desk. She was not emotional. She was not dramatic. She was simply a woman who kept records, and her records said what they said. Marsh tried to interject. Margaret looked at him. "Dr. Marsh," she said with a precision that cut the room quiet. "Before you speak to my professional credibility, you might consider that I am prepared to speak to yours, at length, with documentation." She paused. "The Hendricks baby, 1879. The Farrow twins, 1881. The Morrison delivery, 1882. She let the names sit there. "Shall I continue?" Marsh's face went a color that had no good name. "I'll withdraw the objection," Bradley said quietly. Then Jim Cottrell spoke. He told the story of his brother Randall plainly and without embellishment, the way men who've made peace with grief tell hard stories, not performing the pain, just reporting it, which is sometimes the most devastating way. He named figures. He named dates. He described the specific provisions of the contract that had cost Randall everything, and how those provisions had been explained to Randall, and how the explanation had been different from what was written. The two council members against the wall had gone very still. Thomas's face was exactly what she'd always feared when she imagined this moment composed. Still composed. She had known he would be composed. That composure was his most reliable weapon, and he would not surrender it. But something had changed in the room. She could feel it, the quality of the judge's attention, the way Cole was looking between Thomas and the witnesses with a recalibrating expression. Then Judge Cole looked at Thomas directly and said, "Mr. Vance, in your own words, what did you mean when you told your wife that your daughter was a liability?" The room went absolutely silent. Thomas said, "Your Honor, that's not something Your wife has stated it, under these circumstances. Did you say it or didn't you?" Thomas's jaw moved. The composure was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, like watching a wall hold against pressure. It was built to hold, and seeing the hairline crack appear anyway. "I may have used intemperate language in a moment of, yes or no, Mr. Vance." The silence stretched. "I said something to that effect," Thomas said finally. "In a moment of frustration. It was not a reflection of my actual." "Thank you," Judge Cole said. He looked down at his desk. He looked at Margaret's journal. He looked at his hands. He looked at Sarah. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "Or Miss Caldwell." He chose the second without appearing to notice he had, which was itself something. "The child Lily. How is she currently?" "She's healthy," Sarah said. "She was very ill when we arrived at Mr. Walker's ranch. She recovered. She's been well for 2 weeks." "Mr. Walker provided care. He provided everything," Sarah said. "He and his son." Judge Cole looked at Ethan, who was sitting 3 feet to Sarah's left and had not said a word or shifted his expression throughout the entire proceeding, with the steady, unembarrassed presence of a man who was entirely comfortable being looked at because he had nothing to hide. Cole looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. "I'm making a preliminary ruling," he said. "Pending formal proceedings, custody of the minor child Lily shall remain with the mother Sarah Caldwell. The father Thomas Vance is granted no contact until formal proceedings determine appropriate arrangement." He looked up. "Mr. Bradley, I'd suggest your client consult with you carefully about the wisdom of pursuing formal proceedings given the testimony provided today." He paused. "Because if he does, Miss Hayes and Mr. Cottrell will be heard in full. And I suspect they have considerably more to say than they offered this morning." Bradley's face was the carefully composed face of a lawyer doing a rapid calculation about his client's odds. Thomas looked at Sarah. She looked back at him. Steadily. Entirely herself. He looked away first. Cole closed the proceeding. The room began to move chairs, scraping papers, gathering the general reorganization of a space after a formal thing has ended. Thomas was already in conversation with Bradley, low and terse. Marsh was packing his document case with the focused attention of a man who would very much like to be elsewhere. Gerald let out a breath that seemed to have been trapped since they'd walked in. Jim Cottrell stood and picked up his hat. Margaret closed her journal and put it away for what Sarah suspected was the last time it had done what it was made for. Noah appeared at Sarah's elbow. He looked at her face. He looked at Ethan. He processed whatever he read there. "Did we win?" he said. "We won today," Sarah said. "Is today enough?" Ethan put his hand on Noah's shoulder. "Today's the one we had," he said. "So yes, today is enough." Sarah looked at Ethan over Noah's head. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she'd been learning to read, the one that said something he hadn't put words to yet, and which she now knew he would put words to when he was certain of them, because that was the kind of man he was. She nodded once. He nodded back. Outside, the morning had turned full and bright, the kind of day that made Montana look like it had been built specifically to make people feel the scale of possibility. Lily was awake in Margaret's careful arms, looking at the world with the absolute present-tense attention of a healthy 4-month-old for whom every moment was its own entire universe. Thomas walked past them to his horse. He did not look at Sarah. He mounted and he rode, and Bradley rode with him, and Marsh rode behind, and the three of them went down the road without looking back. Gerald said, "Well, that's that then." "That's the beginning of that," Margaret corrected. "He'll come back. Men like Thomas always come back." She looked at Sarah. "But next time you'll be ready. And next time the judge will already know his name." Sarah watched the road where Thomas had disappeared. She felt Ethan come to stand beside her, close but not touching, because that was how he was careful about the space between himself and other people until the space was offered, and she felt the warmth of his presence without needing anything from it. "He'll regroup," she said quietly. "Yes," Ethan said. "He'll come back differently, smarter." "Yes. And we'll handle it." The "we" again. The word that had appeared 3 weeks ago over a mending project and had simply stayed growing more specific and more certain with every day that passed. "Yes," Ethan said. "We will." Margaret left on Sunday morning. She packed the same way she did everything efficiently without fuss, as though sentiment was a thing she acknowledged in others but did not personally require. She came into the kitchen with her bag already over her arm and her coat on, and stood in the doorway while Sarah was at the stove, and she said, "I'll be in Millard if you need me for the formal proceedings." "We'll need you," Sarah said. "I know." Margaret looked around the kitchen at Noah eating at Lily in her basket at the particular lived-in quality the room had acquired over 3 days that it hadn't had before. "You've built something here," she said. It was not sentimental. It was observational, the way Margaret said most things. "Don't let him take it." "I won't," Sarah said. Margaret nodded once. She looked at Noah. "The biscuits," she said. "Write down the method." Noah looked up, visibly moved. "You want my recipe?" "I want to be able to replicate them when I'm 60 miles away and having a poor morning," Margaret said. "Don't make it into something larger than it is." Noah immediately began making it into something larger than it was, composing himself with visible effort. "Yes, ma'am," he managed. "I'll write it down." Margaret went to the door. At the threshold she paused and looked back at Sarah one final time. Her expression held something that had not been there at the beginning of the week. Not warmth exactly, because warmth was not Margaret's primary mode, but recognition. The specific recognition of one woman for another who had done a hard thing and come out the other side still herself. "You didn't flinch," Margaret said. "I flinched on the inside," Sarah said. Same thing she'd told Gerald days ago. "That's where it doesn't count," Margaret said, and she walked out. The wagon disappeared down the road. Jim Cottrell had gone the day before back to Harlow Creek, back to whatever life he'd built in the aftermath of his brother's ruin. He'd shaken Ethan's hand at the gate and told Sarah that he hoped she and her daughter had a long, quiet life, and the way he said it told her that what he really meant was that he hoped his brother's death had counted for something. It did, she'd told him directly. "Tell him that. However you talk to him now, tell him it counted." Jim had looked at her for a moment. Then he'd nodded and gotten on his horse and ridden east, and Sarah had watched him go and thought about all the people Thomas had moved through, like weather leaving damage, and convincing them it was their own fault, and felt the full weight of what Friday had meant. Not just for her, for all of them. Now it was Sunday, and the house was quiet, in the way it had been before she arrived, except that it wasn't because the quiet itself had changed, had become the quiet of a place with more people in it, rather than fewer the quiet of a Sunday morning where someone was at the stove and someone else was at the table, and the baby was doing the small, satisfied sounds of a child who understood she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Ethan came in from the barn. He looked at the empty chair where Margaret had been sitting. He looked at Sarah. "She gone," he said. "An hour ago." He poured himself coffee and sat down at the table across from Noah, and for a few minutes the kitchen held just the ordinary sounds of a household morning spoon against cup, the creak of the stove, Lily's small negotiations with the world. Then Noah said, "Are they going to stay, Pa?" He said it directly the way he said everything, without appearing to notice that the question had any particular magnitude. He was looking at his father with those eyes that didn't allow for evasion. Ethan looked at his coffee. Then he looked at Sarah. Sarah looked back at him. "That's a conversation for grown people," Ethan said. "I'm asking as a grown person," Noah said. He was 9. He delivered this without irony. "Noah." Ethan's voice was even. "I just want to know," Noah said. "Because Lily needs a yard to learn to walk in, and Sarah fixes things, and the house is better." He said this last part with the flat certainty of someone reporting observable data. "It's just better. With them here." The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan looked at Sarah across the table, and Sarah felt the full particular weight of the moment, not the legal weight of Friday, not the physical weight of 3 weeks of fear and work and holding herself together, but the weight of this ordinary Sunday morning in a kitchen in Montana with a 9-year-old asking the question that neither of the adults at the table had yet found the exact language for. "Yeah," Ethan said finally. His eyes were still on Sarah when he said it. "It is." Sarah looked at her hands on the table. She felt Lily shift in the basket beside her, and she reached out without thinking and put one hand on the edge of the basket, the reflex of a mother whose body had rewired itself over 4 months to keep contact with her daughter. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. She said it to the table, to the room, to no particular person. Then she looked up at Ethan. If that's what you're asking." "It's what I'm asking," he said. Noah, satisfied, went back to his breakfast. 2 weeks passed. Thomas did not come back immediately, which was exactly what Margaret had predicted, and exactly what Sarah had prepared herself for. He would regroup. He would reassess. He would decide whether the cost of pursuing the formal proceedings was worth what it would put on public record about him, and he would weigh that against his pride, which she knew was the most expensive thing Thomas Vance owned. She spent those 2 weeks in a state of careful, deliberate living. Not waiting. She had spent enough of her life waiting. Waiting for moods to pass. Waiting for anger to settle. Waiting to understand whether the day was safe. She was done with waiting. So she moved forward through each day as though it was the only one she had, because she had learned in the particular school of the past month that forward was the only direction that cost less than the alternative. She rode out with Ethan on Tuesday to check the far fence line. She had not ridden much since she was a girl, but her body remembered, and Ethan adjusted the pace without comment until she found it again, and they rode the fence line in the particular easy silence she had grown accustomed to with him. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but full of the things that didn't need saying because they were already understood. Halfway along the fence he said, "Gerald told me something." "What?" Marsh withdrew his letter, the one he submitted as testimony to the judge. Ethan's eyes were forward on the fence line. Filed a correction with the county clerk, saying he'd overstated certain clinical conclusions. Sarah went very still in the saddle. "Why would he do that?" "Because Margaret Hayes wrote him a letter," Ethan said. "I don't know what the letter said, but Gerald said Marsh looked like a man who'd received correspondence that clarified certain things for him." Sarah thought about Margaret and her journal, and the 3 names she'd said, Hendricks Farrow Morrison, and the color that had drained from Marsh's face. "She protected his secret," Sarah said slowly. "For years. Because she's professional. Because doctors protect doctors, even ones who don't deserve it." She paused. "And then she told him she wasn't going to protect it anymore." "That's my read," Ethan said. "She didn't tell me she was going to do that." "No," Ethan said. "She wouldn't. She'd just do it." Sarah looked at the fence line stretching ahead of them, the posts planted in the earth, with the kind of regularity that meant someone had cared enough to do it right. She thought about Margaret Hayes at 61, riding 60 miles by herself to a stranger's house, because a man she'd met 3 days ago had come to her door asking for the truth she'd been keeping for 4 months. She thought about the particular way good people moved through the world, not announcing it, not requiring recognition, just doing what the situation asked, and then getting on their horse and going home. "She's remarkable," Sarah said again. Same thing she'd said the night Margaret arrived. "She is," Ethan agreed. Same thing he'd said then. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with the sun throwing long shadows behind them, and when they came through the gate, Noah was on the porch with Lily in his arms. He'd been practicing the hold all week, getting increasingly confident with it, and Lily had developed the particular contentment of a baby who understood she was held by someone who wasn't going to drop her. "She smiled," Noah announced. "A real one. Not the gas kind. A real one. I made her laugh." "You did not make her laugh," Ethan said, dismounting. "I made her almost laugh. It's the same thing." "It absolutely is not." Sarah climbed down and went to Noah and looked at Lily's face, bright-eyed, alert, exactly the weight she should be, the picture of a child who had decided the world was a reasonable place to be. "She almost laughed at you," Sarah said. "I made a noise," Noah said somewhat defensively. "An unexpected noise." And she responded positively. Sarah reached out and took Lily and held her up at face level and made the same kind of ridiculous sound that mothers have been making at babies since before language, and Lily's face went through 3 distinct expressions, and then arrived at something that was unambiguously completely a smile. Sarah laughed. Out loud, unguarded, the real kind. Behind her, she heard Ethan make a sound that she had started to identify as his version of a laugh, a short exhale through the nose that carried real amusement in it, controlled by a man who'd spent years in rooms where being too unguarded was a liability of some kind, and who was slowly, carefully unlearning that. She turned around with Lily and looked at him. I was looking at them both with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful, evaluating look, not the focused look of a man solving a problem, not even the rare, unguarded warmth she'd caught occasionally in the past 3 weeks. This was something simpler and more foundational than all of those. This was a man looking at something he had not let himself expect, and finding it was real anyway. "What?" she said. He shook his head slightly. "Nothing," he said. "Come inside. It's getting cold." The letter from Bradley arrived on a Thursday. Sarah's hands didn't shake when she opened it, which she noted with quiet satisfaction. 3 months ago they would have. A month ago they might have. Today they didn't. She read it. Then she sat down and read it again more slowly to make sure she was reading it correctly. She was. Clement Bradley, on behalf of his client, Thomas Vance, was formally withdrawing the custody petition filed with the county court. The withdrawal cited procedural grounds in language, so careful and so deliberately neutral that it communicated nothing about what had actually happened while communicating everything. It was Bradley's professional handwriting, Thomas's decision, and the signature of a man who had calculated his odds and found them no longer worth the exposure. The formal proceedings were not going to happen. She sat at the table for a long time with the letter in her hands. Ethan came in from outside, looked at her face and stopped. "What is it?" he said. She held the letter out. He took it and read it, and then he set it down on the table and looked at her. "It's over," she said. She needed to say it out loud. "For now," he said, because he was honest, and he would not tell her. Thomas was gone forever, when neither of them knew that. But then he said, "For now is real. For now is something to build on." She nodded. She looked at the letter. She thought about 4 days of Montana summer, and 6 closed doors, and a porch she'd fallen to her knees on, and a man who had opened his door and kept it open. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. I need to tell you something." He sat down across from her. He waited. That was the thing about Ethan. He waited with his full attention, not impatiently, not performing patience, just genuinely present for whatever was coming. "When I knocked on your door," she said, "I was going to ask you to take Lily and let me go. I had decided I'd made myself accept that she was better off without me. That I'd failed her. That the best thing I could do was find her somewhere safe and then just disappear. Let her grow up without the thing I'd become." Ethan was very still. "I know that now," he said quietly. "I think I knew it then. What you said to me that night about why you didn't just take her and close the door." She looked at him steadily. "You said it looked like what I needed was someone to keep me from walking away from her." "I remember. You were right," she said. "And I don't know how you saw it that clearly in 30 seconds looking at a stranger on your porch. But you did. And that—" She stopped. Her voice had done something she was going to allow for exactly this sentence. "That saved her life, but it also saved mine. And I needed you to know that I know that." The kitchen was absolutely quiet except for Lily, who had decided something in her basket required comment. Ethan looked at Sarah across the table for a long moment. Then he reached across and put his hand over hers on the table, not grasping, just covering the weight of it, simple and certain. "You saved your own life," he said. "You picked her up and you walked. I just opened a door." "It was the right door," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It was." Noah came downstairs at that exact moment, with his complete absence of timing, and stopped when he saw their hands on the table. He looked at his father. He looked at Sarah. He completed whatever internal assessment he was making. "Are you two finally going to talk about it?" he said. "Noah," Ethan said. "I've been waiting 3 weeks. You are 9 years old, and I have been very patient," Noah said, pulling out his chair and sitting down with the composure of someone who has decided to be part of a conversation, whether he's been invited or not. "I would like to register that patience." Sarah looked at Ethan. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not quite a laugh, but contained all the materials of one. "We're talking about it," Ethan told his son. "Good," Noah said. He reached for an apple. "It's about time." The formal proceedings never came. In their place came something quieter and considerably harder to name. The particular daily work of building a thing that had no precedent and no template. 2 people and 2 children and a ranch, and the slow, unannounced accumulation of a life shared. Ethan asked Sarah to marry him in October on the porch in the plain. Straightforward way he did everything. No ceremony, no lengthy preamble. Just the question itself, said directly with his full attention on her face. She said yes, the same way. Noah, who had been inside and came out 3 minutes later to find them standing on the porch, not quite touching, and both of them with the particular expression of people who have just exchanged something real, looked at his father and said, "Finally." Ethan looked at his son. "I said it to myself too," Noah said. "Many times, internally and externally." "I know you did," Ethan said. Margaret Hayes came to the wedding. She sat in the front and wore her good coat and did not cry, but she gripped Sarah's hand before the vows with a pressure that said everything her face wouldn't. Jim Cottrell came. Gerald and his Margaret came, his Margaret crying enough for everyone in the room who wasn't. The valley talked. It had talked before, and it talked after, and it would talk again. That was the nature of small places, the way they processed the things that happened inside them. But the talk had changed. It had shifted the way the talk always shifted when enough time passed, and what it was talking about turned out to be simply a family. A man and a woman, and 2 children, and a working ranch, and a life that looked from any reasonable distance like exactly what it was. That winter 2 women came to the Walker Ranch within 3 weeks of each other. The first came alone on foot with a bruise on her face, she'd explained as a fall, until Sarah looked at her the way Margaret had once looked at Sarah and asked again and got a different answer. The second came with 3 children and no husband and $40 she was trying to make last until she could find work. Ethan did not hesitate either time. The first woman stayed a month. They helped her find her sister in Billings and put her on a stage with enough money to get there. The second woman, a practical, capable person named Della, who had more skills than she'd been given credit for, ended up staying through the spring and then deciding to stay altogether, which was how the Walker Ranch acquired a second pair of working hands, and how Noah acquired the kind of friend who was neither quite sibling nor quite not. Sarah, watching Della settle in with the same practical efficiency she herself had once settled in with, felt something clarify that had been forming quietly in the back of her mind for months. "We could do this deliberately," she told Ethan one evening. He looked at her. "We've been doing it deliberately." "More deliberately," she said. "Formally. Let people know there's somewhere to go. Not just women who find us by accident." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're talking about making this a known place." I'm talking about making this the door that's open," she said. "The one I was looking for. The one that was always supposed to be at the end of that road." He looked at her for a long time with that expression she had learned entirely by now, the one that meant he was certain but wanted to be sure he was certain before he said so. "All right," he said. "All right. Let's build it." The spring came in with the full and unreserved commitment that Montana Springs had sudden total converting the brown and frozen world into something that looked like it had been practicing color for months and was now deploying it all at once. The garden Ethan kept along the south side of the house got larger. Sarah expanded it on the west side with vegetables she'd been planting since January. Lily, who had gone from barely breathing at 4 months to pulling herself upright against every available surface, at 7 months, was now conducting a systematic investigation of the world at floor level, with the focused intensity of a small person who suspected it contained considerably more than she'd so far been shown. Noah, approaching 10, had developed the particular dignity of a boy who felt himself on the edge of something not quite childhood, not quite what came next, and carried himself with a gravity that occasionally cracked open to reveal the 9-year-old underneath, usually in the presence of Lily, doing something funny, at which point all gravity was lost entirely. On an evening in April, Ethan came in from the paddock and found Sarah at the table writing letters. She had been writing letters for 3 months to church groups, to the County Women's Society, to a woman in Billings who had written a piece in the Gazette about the particular difficulties facing women on the frontier, to Margaret, who wrote back in precise and useful sentences. A network assembled letter by letter, post by post. The way you built anything real, one connection at a time. He sat down across from her and watched her write. "You never stop," he said. It was not a complaint. It was said with the simple wonder of a man who recognized a quality in another person that he had no analog for in himself. "I have 4 months of standing still to make up for," she said without looking up. 4 years, actually. "You weren't standing still," he said. "You were surviving." She looked up at that. He said things like that occasionally, plain direct, with the matter-of-fact quality of a man who said things because they were true, and not because he was trying to comfort her, which made them considerably more comforting than comfort. "You're getting better at saying things," she said. "Don't tell Noah, he'll want credit." She laughed, the real kind again. It still surprised her sometimes, the ease of it, the availability of it, how close to the surface it lived now compared to where it had been a year ago. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. Do you know what I thought the first night? When Margaret came and you came back early, and we were all sitting around this table." She set down her pen. "I thought this is what I was walking toward. Not this house, not you specifically, not any one thing, just this. People around a table deciding together that something was worth fighting for." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't know what it looked like. I just knew it existed. And I walked toward it anyway." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You always knew it existed," he said. "Somewhere under everything Thomas spent 4 years telling me," she said. "Yes, somewhere under all of that I knew." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. Outside, Lily was doing something that required Noah's immediate attention and produced a sound that was recognizably, undeniably, completely a laugh. Her first one. A real one. Sarah and Ethan both went, still listening to it. The high, pure, uncomplicated sound of a child who had never known anything but safety, and chose this moment to announce it to everyone within earshot. Sarah felt Ethan's hand tighten around hers. She held on. A woman who walks through fire, carrying the thing she loves most, doesn't come out the other side, diminished. She comes out knowing exactly what she's made of. Sarah Caldwell had walked 4 days through Montana summer with nothing but her daughter and her refusal, and she had found a door that opened, and behind that door, she had found the one thing no one can give you, and no one can take away the knowledge that you were always worth fighting for. That was the thing Thomas Vance had never understood and never would. You cannot break a woman who has already decided what she will not surrender.